Rome, October 14th, 1963. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel Excelsior smelled like champagne and old money. 500 people packed inside. Film executives from 3 continents. Directors whose names appeared above the title. Actors whose faces appeared on every marquee in the Western world. It was the kind of room where reputations were made and unmade in the span of a single sentence. Audrey Hepburn stood at the podium with an award in her hands she hadn't expected to receive, and Marlon Brando stood up from his table near the center of the room and said something into that silence that nobody there ever forgot. What she did next didn't make headlines. It wasn't covered in Variety or The Hollywood Reporter. It wasn't photographed or recorded. It lived only in the memory of the people who were there, and in what happened in the 48 hours that followed, quietly, without fanfare, in a way that was entirely, unmistakably Audrey. This is that story, the one nobody tells. To understand what happened that night in Rome, you have to understand where Audrey Hepburn was in October of 1963. Not professionally. Professionally, she was at the summit of everything. Roman Holiday, Sabrina, Breakfast at Tiffany's, Charade, released just that year, already a sensation. She had an Oscar, she had a Tony, she had a face that photographers called the most photographed of the 20th century, but that wasn't where she was, not really. The spring of 1963 had left something broken in her that hadn't healed. A marriage to Mel Ferrer had entered one of its long, painful silences. She had suffered another miscarriage, her second in February, in their home in Switzerland, in the middle of winter, almost entirely alone. She had been working constantly for a decade, and the work had been magnificent, but the work had cost her something. The quiet life she dreamed of, the children she ached for. She had come to Rome reluctantly. She said no twice. On the third asking, she agreed. 2 nights, 1 appearance, then home. She wasn't in Rome to be celebrated. She was barely in Rome at all. She was going through the motions the way people do when grief hasn't finished with them, but the world requires your presence anyway. The award she received that night was the Stella D'Oro, the Golden Star, given annually by the Italian Cinema Foundation to an international performer whose work had elevated the art of cinema in the Italian cultural consciousness. It was a genuine honor. The committee had deliberated for months. The choice of Audrey was not controversial, but standing at that podium, holding that heavy crystal star, Audrey Hepburn felt like an imposter. She always felt that way. People who knew her well understood that beneath the composure and the grace, Audrey carried a quiet, persistent conviction that she didn't quite deserve what she had. It wasn't false modesty, it was something older, something that came from a childhood in which the ground was never stable, in which a young girl learned early that nothing could be counted on. She had grown up in the Netherlands during the German occupation. She had gone hungry. She had watched things happen to people she loved that no child should watch. And the woman who stood on the stages of Hollywood and accepted the applause of the world had never entirely stopped being that child, half-starved and watchful, waiting for the floor to give way. So when she stood at that podium with the Stella D'Oro and looked out at 500 faces, what she felt was not triumph, she felt exposed. Her speech was brief. That was always her way. She thanked the foundation. She thanked the Italian directors and crews. She said something quiet and genuine about what Rome had meant to her, how she had filmed her first great role here a decade ago, young and uncertain and completely in love with the city. She thanked the room. She smiled that smile. She started to step back from the microphone, and then Marlon Brando stood up. He had been at a table to her left, surrounded by Italian producers and an American director whose name the newspapers would not print in connection with what happened next. He had been drinking, not visibly, not obviously, but those near him would say later that he had been drinking steadily since dinner began. He stood up in that particular way that very famous, very powerful men stand up in public, with the absolute certainty that their standing is itself an event. He began to clap, slowly, deliberately, the way a man claps when he is not applauding. The sound cut through the polite applause still trickling through the room. People nearest to him stopped first. Then the silence spread outward like a stone dropped in still water. Audrey stopped, still at the podium, still holding the award, looking at him. Brando spoke. His voice was the voice everyone in that room recognized, that low, carefully cultivated instrument that critics had spent a decade trying to describe. He projected it without apparent effort, so that it reached every corner of that ballroom. "They give awards now for learning to cry on cue," he said. "How perfectly European. 500 people did not breathe. He wasn't finished. All of this he gestured at the room, at the ceremony, at the crystal award in Audrey's hands, is theatre. It's not cinema. It's not art. It's commerce dressed in evening clothes, giving statues to pretty women so they'll keep making pictures that sell tickets. Audrey Hepburn is a lovely woman. She has lovely eyes. She has made lovely pictures. None of them have said anything true about the human condition. Not one frame. He sat back down. The silence lasted what felt like a very long time. Audrey stood at the podium and said nothing for what witnesses later described as 8 seconds, 10, 15. A woman nearby would say afterward that she saw Audrey's hands tighten, just slightly, on the award she was holding. That was all. Her face didn't change in any way that was legible. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet. Not theatrical quiet, not the kind of quiet that is actually very loud. Simply quiet. The room had to lean in to hear her. "Mr. Brando," she said, "thank you." A pause. "I've thought for a long time that the most generous thing one artist can do for another is to tell them the truth. I hope I can earn that someday." She stepped back from the microphone. She walked off the stage. She walked through the ballroom to her table, sat down, picked up her glass of water, and drank from it with a steady hand. The room erupted. Not in anger, in something more complex than anger. Relief, perhaps. Admiration. The particular electricity of having witnessed someone absorb a blow with a grace that made the person who threw it look suddenly, irreversibly small. What nobody in that room knew, what almost nobody knew at all, was what Audrey did in the 48 hours that followed. The morning after the gala, Audrey woke early in her suite, as she always did. She ordered coffee. She sat at the small writing desk near the window and looked out at the Roman morning, the light coming in low and golden over the rooftops, the way it does in October when the city is cooling down from summer and finding itself again. She thought about what Brando had said, not about the cruelty of it, not about her reputation or what the newspapers would write. She thought about whether he was right. That was Audrey Hepburn. In the aftermath of the most public humiliation of her professional life, she sat alone in a Roman morning and honestly asked herself whether her critic had a point. She was not a method actor. She had never trained the way Brando had trained. She came from the stage, from ballet, from a discipline that was about grace and economy of movement rather than excavating the interior. She had learned what she learned on the job, from directors who loved her, from her own instincts. She was not Lee Strasberg. She was not the actor's studio. But she had also survived the hunger winter of 1944. She had watched her uncle shot in the street. She had known what it felt like for reality to become almost unbearable and had kept on existing through it anyway. She had carried that weight her entire life, quietly, without making it into a performance. If that wasn't truth about the human condition, she didn't know what was. She finished her coffee. She closed her notebook. She made a phone call. The person she called was not her publicist, not her lawyer, not her husband in Switzerland. She called a Jesuit priest named Father Giacomo Rossi, who ran a small orphanage in the Trastevere neighborhood, the old working-class quarter on the far side of the Tiber. She had visited once before, 2 years earlier, on a quiet afternoon when her driver had taken her somewhere she hadn't been before. She had never forgotten it. Father Rossi had not expected to hear from her again. He was a small, practical man in his 60s who had spent 30 years doing unglamorous work without expectation of recognition. When he heard Audrey's voice that morning, he was completely surprised. She asked if she could come. Not for a visit, not for a photo opportunity. She wanted to spend the day if that was acceptable. She would bring nothing. No cameras, no press, no assistants, just herself. Father Rossi said, of course, come. The orphanage on the Via della Lungaretta was not beautiful. It was a converted building from the 18th century, with drafty corridors and paint that had given up years ago, and a courtyard where the children played in the uneven light that came through a gap in the surrounding walls. There were 31 children in residence that autumn, ages 2 to 14. Some had lost parents to illness, some to poverty. A few had simply been left, in circumstances that Father Rossi described with characteristic brevity as complicated. Audrey arrived at 9 in the morning in a plain coat and flat shoes. No makeup beyond what any woman might wear on a cool October day. She introduced herself to Father Rossi as if he might not know who she was, which made him smile. She spent the first 2 hours in the small classroom where the younger children were taught by a volunteer teacher named Sister Caterina, a young nun barely out of her 20s, who was clearly overwhelmed and clearly committed and clearly exhausted. Audrey sat at a child's desk at the back of the room and watched the lesson. She did not interrupt. She did not introduce herself as anyone. She was simply a woman at a small desk, watching children learn to read. One of the children, a girl of about 5, very small, with dark eyes that seemed to process everything at twice the normal speed, turned around in the middle of the lesson and stared at Audrey with the complete directness that only very young children possess. She stared for perhaps 30 seconds, then she walked back through the rows of desks, climbed onto the empty chair next to Audrey's, and said in Italian, "You have sad eyes." Audrey looked at her. "Yes," she said, also in Italian, "I do sometimes." The girl considered this. "My eyes were sad too before I came here. Now they are less sad. Maybe yours will be less sad too." She climbed back down and returned to her seat. Audrey ate lunch with the children. Simple food: bread, soup, fruit. In the afternoon she helped with the laundry. This was not a gesture. Father Rossi had not asked her to help with the laundry. She had seen 2 of the older children struggling with a large basket in the courtyard and had walked over and taken one end of it, and that was that. She spent the better part of an hour folding children's clothes on a long wooden table in the cold courtyard sun, talking to a 13-year-old girl named Sophia about the difference between Rome and Paris. Sophia asked her what she did for work. Audrey said she was an actress. Sophia considered this. "Is it good work?" she asked. "Sometimes," Audrey said. "What do you want to do?" Sophia thought for a moment. "Something that stays," she said. "Something that is still there tomorrow." Audrey folded a small blue sweater. "That's what I want too," she said. She stayed until evening. When it was time to leave, Father Rossi walked her to the door. He told her about the roof leaking for 3 years in the north wing, where 6 of the older children slept. Every significant rain left standing water in their rooms. The repairs would cost 4 million lire, a sum that was, for the orphanage, effectively impossible. He also told her about Sister Caterina, the best teacher the children had ever had, who had recently received a paid offer from a school in Milan and was likely to take it. He couldn't blame her, but he didn't know what the children would do without her. Audrey listened without expression. She said good night. She thanked him. She left. 3 weeks later, Father Rossi received 2 bank transfers. The first covered the full cost of the roof repairs, with an additional sum for future maintenance. The second covered 12 months of salary for Sister Caterina, enough to keep her in Rome, enough to tell her she was valued, enough to give her a reason to stay. No name was attached, no foundation, no press release, no announcement of any kind. The roof was repaired, Sister Caterina stayed, the children slept through the rain. The story of what Brando said at the gala did appear in the Italian press. A column inch here and there. Audrey's response was quoted admiringly. Brando's remarks were attributed to drink and forgotten within a week. Brando said nothing publicly for 17 days. What finally moved him was a phone call from a woman named Gianna Marcovaldi, a set decorator who had been at the gala. She called his hotel room. He was still in Rome, finishing a picture, not to scold him, simply to tell him, very quietly, what Audrey had done. She had heard from a friend of Father Rossi's. She wanted Brando to know. She didn't explain why. She told him and hung up. Brando sat in his room for a long time after that call. He had called her a woman with lovely eyes, who made lovely pictures that said nothing true about the human condition. He had said it because he believed it, or because he had convinced himself he believed it, which is not the same thing, in part because he was drunk. In part because Audrey Hepburn standing at that podium looking like everything she was had made him, for reasons he couldn't fully name, deeply uncomfortable. And then she had gone, quietly, without cameras, and sat in a room full of orphaned children, and listened to them, and helped them fold laundry, and then paid for their roof and their teacher, without telling a single person. He picked up a pen. He wrote a letter. The letter arrived at Audrey's home in Bergenstock, forwarded from Rome. It was 4 pages, handwritten. It did not begin with an apology. It began with a question, which was, in its way, more honest than an apology would have been. He asked her how she did it. He meant the orphanage. He meant the quiet of it, the absence of performance. He had been performing his whole life, on stages, on sets, in interviews, in rooms full of people who needed him to be Marlon Brando. He had made his inner life into an instrument, and then been unable to stop playing it, even when he wanted to. He asked her how she went somewhere that hard and just sat with it without making it into something. He also said he had been wrong about her pictures, about what truth looked like. He said he had confused rawness with truth and difficulty with depth. He said that hearing about one person sitting at a small desk at the back of a classroom full of orphaned children without requiring anything of the moment had shown him something he hadn't expected to be shown. He did not write the words "I'm sorry," but the letter was, in every meaningful sense, an apology. Audrey read it once, carefully, at the kitchen table in Bergenstock. Then she put it in the drawer of her writing desk, where she kept the small number of things she found genuinely important. She wrote back, half a page. She said she didn't know how she did it. She wasn't sure she did. She said the girl with the sad eyes had done something for her that day that she was still trying to understand. The best she could say was that presence was not a performance. It was an abdication of performance, and she was still learning what that meant. She signed it simply, Audrey. She did not return to acting immediately. She finished the commitments she had already made, and then in 1967, she stepped back. She went home. She had a son. She made a life in Switzerland that was ordinary in the most deliberate way. In 1988, she became a Goodwill ambassador for UNICEF. She was 60 years old. She spent the next 5 years traveling to the places where children were dying from causes that were preventable: Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, El Salvador, Somalia. She went without fanfare, or with as little as could be managed. She sat in the dust with children who were hungry. She held them. She looked at the cameras when they were there and spoke clearly about what she had seen. But the thing she valued was the time before the cameras arrived and after they left, the time when she was simply a woman sitting in the dust, present with what was in front of her. She had learned this in a cold courtyard in Rome, folding small blue sweaters, talking about Paris with a girl who had never been anywhere. The girl with the dark eyes grew up. Her name was Marta. Sister Katerina, who stayed and taught for 11 more years after that October, was her favorite teacher. Marta studied. She graduated. She became a nurse in a hospital a few streets from where she had grown up. She married. She had children of her own. She did not know Audrey Hepburn's name for many years. She was 5 years old when they met. She remembered only a tall, quiet woman at the back of the classroom, with eyes that made her feel something she couldn't name. When she was in her 30s, a colleague mentioned Audrey Hepburn. They were watching a documentary, archival images on a television screen, and Marta looked up and went very still. Then she said, "I know her. I met her once when I was a child." Her colleague was skeptical. Marta didn't try to explain. She just looked at the screen and at those eyes, the ones she had noticed when she was 5, when she had climbed off her chair and walked to the back of the room to say something honest to a stranger. She had sad eyes, Marta said, but they were getting better. She was quiet for a moment. "I think they did get better," she said. Eventually, Audrey Hepburn died in January of 1993 of colon cancer in the house in Switzerland she had loved completely. She was 63 years old. At the end of her life, someone asked her what she considered the most important thing she had ever done. She thought about it. She said, "Being present. When I managed to be present, that's all it was." The interviewer wrote it down. Later, reviewing the tape, he decided it wasn't quotable enough. Not specific, not cinematic, not the kind of line that plays well in a profile. He wrote around it, used other things she had said. That line ended up on the cutting room floor. But it was the truest thing she said that day. Marlon Brando stood up in a ballroom in Rome and said her pictures said nothing true about the human condition. He was wrong, but he was wrong in an interesting way. He was looking at the pictures and missing the woman. He was measuring the performance and missing the presence. The truest thing Audrey Hepburn ever made wasn't a film. It was a life. The generosity that went unannounced, the attention that went unphotographed, the love that went uncelebrated by anyone except the people who received it. She would have hated being described that way. She would have deflected and smiled and changed the subject. But it's true. It was always true. And the children in that courtyard in Trastevere, playing football in the October light, knew it, even if they didn't know her name. If you love stories about the humanity behind the legends, the private moments that shaped the public figures, subscribe. These are the stories that matter.